Dies mies chet poene doesef duvem enitem maus. Close upon this thundering there came a momentary darkening of the daylight, though sunset was still an hour distant, and then a puff of added odor, different from the first, but equally unknown and intolerable. Charles was chanting again now, and his mother could hear syllables that sounded like Yinash, Yog, Sothoth, He, Luglub, Fe, Throdog, ending in Yah, whose maniacal force mounted in an ear-splitting crescendo. A second later, all previous memories were effaced by the wailing scream which burst out with frantic explosiveness and gradually changed form to a paroxysm of diabolic and hysterical laughter. Mrs. Ward, with the mingled fear and blind courage of maternity, advanced and knocked affrightedly at the concealing panels, but obtained no sign of recognition. She knocked again, but paused nervously as a second shriek arose, this one unmistakably in the familiar voice of her son, and sounding concurrently with the still bursting cachinnations of that other voice. Presently she fainted. Although she is still unable to recall the precise and immediate cause, memory sometimes makes merciful deletions. Mr. Ward returned from the business section at 6:15, and not finding his wife downstairs, was told by frightened servants that she was probably watching at Charles's door, from which the sounds had been far stranger than ever before. Mounting the stairs at once, he saw Mrs. Ward stretched at full length on the floor of the corridor outside the laboratory, and realizing that she had fainted, hastened to fetch a glass of water from a set bowl in a neighboring alcove, dashing the cold fluid in her face. He was heartened to observe an immediate response on her part, and was watching the bewildered opening of her eyes when a chill shot through him and threatened to reduce him to the very state from which she was emerging. For the seemingly silent laboratory was not as silent as it had appeared to be, but held the murmurs of a tense, muffled conversation in tones too low for comprehension, yet of a quality profound, disturbing to the soul. It was not, of course, new for Charles to mutter formulae, but this muttering was definitely different. It was so palpably a dialogue, or imitation of inflections, suggesting question and answer, statement and response. One voice was undisguisedly that of Charles, but the other had a depth and hollowness which the use past best powers of ceremonial mimicry had scarcely approached before. There was something hideous, blasphemous, and abnormal about it. But for a cry from his recovering wife, which cleared his mind by arousing his protective instincts, it is not likely that Theodore Howland Ward could have maintained for nearly a year more of his old boast that he had never fainted. As it was, he seized his wife in his arms and bore her quickly downstairs before she could notice the voices which had so horribly disturbed him. Even so, however, he was not quick enough to escape catching something himself, which caused him to stagger dangerously with his burden. For Mrs. Ward's cry had evidently been heard by others. Then he and there had come in response to it from behind the locked door the first distinguishable words which that masked and terrible colloquy had yielded. They were merely an excited caution in Charles's own voice, but somehow their implications had held a nameless fright. For the father who overheard them, the phrase was just this: "Shh! Right!" Mr. and Mrs. Ward conferred at some length after dinner, and the former resolved to have a firm and serious talk with Charles that very night. No matter how important the object, such conduct could not longer be permitted. For these latest developments transcended every limit of sanity and formed a menace to the order and nervous well-being of the entire household. The youth must indeed have taken complete leave of his senses, since only downright madness could have prompted the wild screams and imaginary conversations in assumed voices which the present day had brought forth. All this must be stopped, or Mrs. Ward would be made ill and the keeping of servants become an impossibility. Now, let people practice their own religion in their, studies and whatnot. Nothing, just don't pay attention to their praying if it upsets you so much. If this is what's going on in your real life. But remember the case of Aleister Crowley. He heard that voice, from his left in that Cairo motel that told him the book of the law? Mr. Ward rose at the close of the meal and started upstairs for Charles's laboratory. On the third floor, however, he paused at the sounds, which he heard proceeding from the now disused library of his son. Books were apparently being flung about and papers wildly rustled. And upon stepping to the door, Mr. Ward beheld the youth within, excitedly assembling a vast army of literary matter of every size and shape. Charles's aspect was very drawn and haggard, and he dropped his entire load with a start at the sound of his father's voice. At the elder man's command, he sat down, and for some time listened to the admonitions he had long so deserved. There was no scene. Yeah, you don't have to yell out your rituals, thank you very much. Try to make yourself move without, There was no scene. At the end of the lecture, he agreed that his father was right, and that his voices, mutterings, incantations, and chemical odors were indeed inexcusable nuisances. He agreed to a policy of greater quiet, though insisting on a prolongation of his extreme privacy. Much of his future work, he said, was, in any case, purely book research, and he could obtain quarters elsewhere for any such vocal rituals as might be necessary at a later stage. For the fright and fainting of his mother, he expressed the keenest contrition, and explained that the conversation later heard was part of an elaborate symbolism designed to create a certain mental atmosphere. His use of abstruse chemical terms somewhat bewildered Miss Ward, but the parting impression was one of undeniable sanity and poise, despite a mysterious tension of the utmost gravity. The interview was really quite inconclusive. As Charles picked up his armful and left the room, Mr. Ward hardly knew what to make of the entire business. It was as mysterious as the death of poor old Nig, whose stiffening form, still kind of refers to Indar, the archdemon, can't we refer that to there? With staring eyes and fear-distorted mouth, had been found an hour before in the basement. Driven by some vague detective instinct, the bewildered parent now glanced curiously at the vacant shelves to see what his son had taken up to the attic. The youth's library was plainly and rigidly classified, so that one might tell at a glance the books, or at least the kind of books, which had been withdrawn. On this occasion, Mr. Ward was astonished to find nothing of the occult or the antiquarian, beyond what had previously been removed, was missing. These new withdrawals were all modern items: history, scientific trees, geographies, manuals of literature, philosophic works, and certain contemporary newspapers and magazines. It was a very curious shift from Charles Ward's recent run of reading. And the father paused in a growing vortex of perplexity at an engulfing sense of strangeness. The strangeness was a very poignant sensation, and almost clawed at his chest as he strove to see just what was wrong around him. Something was indeed wrong, and tangibly as well as spiritually so. Ever since he had been in this room, he had known that something was amiss, and that at last it dawned upon him what it was. On the north wall rose the still ancient carved overmantel from the house of Olney Court, but to the cracked and precariously restored oils of the large Kerwin portrait disaster had come. Time and unequal heating had done their work at last, and at some time since the room's last cleaning, the worst had happened. Peeling clear of the wood, curling tighter and tighter, and finally crumbling into small bits with what must have been unlikely, silent suddenness. The portrait of Joseph Kerwin had resigned forever its staring surveillance of the youth it so strangely resembled, and now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine bluish-gray dust. Chapter 4, A Mutation and a Madness. Part 1. In the week following that memorable Good Friday, Charles Ward was seen more often than usual, and was continually carrying books between his library and the attic laboratory. His actions were quiet and rational, but he had a furtive, hunted look, which his mother did not like, and developed an incredibly ravenous appetite, as gauged by his demands upon the cook. Dr. Willett had been told of those Friday noises and happenings, and on the following Tuesday had a long conversation with the youth in the library, where the pitcher stared no more. The interview was, as always, inconclusive, but Willett is still ready to swear that the youth was sane, and himself, at the time, he held out promises of an early revelation and spoke of the need of securing a laboratory elsewhere. At the loss of the portrait, he grieved singularly, little considering his first enthusiasm over it, but seemed to find something of positive humor in its sudden crumbling. About the second week, Charles began to be absent from the house for long periods, and one day when good old Black Hannah came to help with the spring cleaning, she mentioned his frequent visits to the old house in Olney Court, where he would come with a large valise and perform curious delvings in the cellar. He was always very liberal to her and to old Asa, but it seemed more worried than he used to be, which grieved her very much, since she had watched him grow up from birth. Another report of his doings came from Pawtuxet, where some friends of the family saw him at a distance a surprising number of times. He seemed to haunt the resort and canoe house of roads on the Pawtuxet, and subsequent inquiries by Dr. Willett at that place brought out the fact that his purpose was always to secure access to a rather hedged-in riverbank, along which he could walk toward the north, usually not reappearing for a long while. Later in May came a momentary revival of ritualistic sounds in the attic library, which brought a stern reproof from Mr. Ward and a somewhat distracted promise of amendment from Charles. It occurred one morning and seemed to form a resumption of the imaginary conversation noted on that turbulent Good Friday. The youth was arguing or remonstrating hotly with himself, for there suddenly burst forth a perfectly distinguishable series of clashing shouts in different tones, like alternate demands and denials, which caused Mrs. Ward to run upstairs and listen at the door. She could hear no more than a fragment whose only plain words were, "Must have it read for 3 months." And upon her knocking, all sounds ceased at once. When Charles was later questioned by his father, he said that there were certain conflicts of spheres of consciousness which only great skill could avoid, but which he would try to transfer to other realms. About the middle of June, a queer nocturnal incident occurred. In the early evening, there had been some noise and thumping in the lavatory upstairs, and Mrs. Ward was on the point of investigating when it suddenly quieted down that midnight. After the family had retired, the butler was night-locking the front door when, according to his statement, Charles appeared somewhat blunderingly and uncertainly at the foot of the stairs with a large suitcase and made signs that he wished egress. The youth spoke no word, but the worthy Yorkshireman caught one sight of his fevered eyes and trembled cautiously. He opened the door, and the young Ward went out. But in the morning the butler gave in his notice to Mrs. Ward. There was, he said, something unholy in the glance Charles had fixed on him. It was no way for young gentlemen to look at an honest person, and he could not possibly stay another night. Mrs. Ward allowed the man to depart, but she did not value his statement highly. To fancy Charles in a savage state that night was quite ridiculous, for as long as she had remained awake, she had heard faint sounds from the laboratory above, sounds as if of sobbing and pacing, and of a sighing which told only of despair's profoundest depths. Mrs. Ward had grown used to listening for sounds in the night, for the mystery of her son was fast driving all else from her mind. The next evening, much as on another evening, nearly 3 months before, Charles Ward seized the newspaper very early and accidentally lost the main section. This matter was not recalled till later, when Dr. Willett began checking up loose ends and searching out missing links here and there. In the journal office he found the section which Charles had lost, and marked 2 items as if of possible significance. They were as follows. More cemetery delving. It was this morning discovered by Robert Hart, night watchman at the North Burial Ground, that ghouls were again at work in the ancient portion of the cemetery, the grave of Ezra Whedon, who was born in 1740 and died in 1824, according to his uprooted and savagely splintered slate headstone, was found excavated and rifled, the work being evidently done with a spade stolen from an adjacent tool shed. Whatever the contents may have been, after more than a century of burial, all was gone except a few slivers of decayed wood. There were no wheel tracks, but the police have measured a single set of footprints which they found in the vicinity, and which indicate the boots of a man of refinement. Hart is inclined to link this incident with the digging discovered last March, when a party in a motor truck were frightened away after making deep excavation. But Sergeant Riley of the 2nd Station discounts this theory and points to vital differences in the 2 cases. In March, the digging hand had been in a spot where no grave was known, but this time a well-marked and cared-for grave had been rifled with every evidence of deliberate purpose, and with a conscious malignity expressed in the splintering of the slab, which had been intact up to the day before. Members of the Whedon family, noticed of the happening, expressed their astonishment and regret, and were wholly unable to think of any enemy who would care to violate the grave of their ancestor, Hazard Whedon of 598 Angell Street. Recalls a family legend according to which Ezra Whedon was involved in some very peculiar circumstances, not dishonorable to himself, shortly before the Revolution, but of any modern feud or mystery he is frankly ignorant. Inspector Cunningham has been assigned to the case, and hopes to uncover some valuable clues in the near future. Dogs noisy in Pawtuxet. Residents of Pawtuxet were aroused about 3 a.m. today by a phenomenal baying of dogs, which seemed to center near the river just north of Rhodes on the Pawtuxet. The volume and quality of the howling were unusually odd, according to most who heard it, and Fred Lemden, night watchman at Rhodes, declares it was mixed with something very like the shrieks of a man, in mortal terror and agony, a sharp and very brief thunderstorm, which seemed to strike somewhere near the bank of the river, put an end to the disturbance. Strange and unpleasant odors, probably from the oil tanks along the bay, are popularly linked with this incident, and may have had their share in exciting the dogs. The aspect of Charles now became very haggard and hunted, and all agreed in retrospect that he may have wished at this period to make some statement or confession from which sheer terror withheld him. The morbid listening of his mother in the night brought out the fact that he made frequent sallies abroad under the cover of darkness, and most of the more academic alienists unite at present in charging him with the revolting cases of vampirism, which the press so sensationally reported about this time, but which have not been definitely traced to any known perpetrator. These cases, too recent and celebrated to need detailed mention, involved victims of every age and type, and seemed to cluster around two distinct localities, the residential hill and the north end near the ward home, and the suburban districts across the Cranston line near Pawtuxet. Both late wayfarers and sleepers with open windows were attacked, and those who lived to tell the tale spoke of unanimously of a lean, lithe, leaping monster with burning eyes which fastens its teeth in the throat or upper arm and feasted ravenously. Dr. Willett, who refuses to date the madness of Charles Ward as far back as even this, is cautious in attempting to explain these horrors. He declares, certain theories of his own, and limits his positive statements to a peculiar kind of negation. I will not, he says, state who or what I believe perpetrated these attacks and murders, but I will declare that Charles Ward was innocent of them. I have reason to be sure he was ignorant of the taste of blood, as indeed his continued anemic decline and increasing pallor prove better than any verbal argument. Ward meddled with that terrible thing, but has paid for it, and he was never a monster or villain. As for now, I do not like to think. A change came, and I am content to believe that the old Charles Ward died with it. His soul did anyhow, for that mad flesh that vanished from Waite's hospital had another. The urulu and perhaps other papaya help people from not getting sick as much when they consume blood, and perhaps there's other plants too. Willett speaks with authority, for he was often at the Ward home attending Mrs. Ward, whose nerves had begun to snap under the strain. Nocturnal listening had bred some morbid hallucinations, which she confided to the doctor with hesitancy, and which he ridiculed in talking to her, although they made him ponder deeply when alone. These delusions always concerned the faint sounds which he fancied she'd heard in the attic lavatory and bedroom, and emphasized the occurrence of muffled sighs and sobbings at the most impossible times. Early in July, Willett ordered Mrs. Ward to Atlantic City for an indefinite recuperative sojourn, and cautioned both Mr. Ward and the haggard and elusive Charles to write her only cheering letters. It is probably to this enforced and reluctant escape that she owes her life and continued sanity. Now, sometimes there are psychiatrists that will label things as insane because, not part of their spiritual system, or maybe they're trying to deny publicly that there are spiritual capabilities. So, being confused about physical reality is quite a different thing to saying that there is another level of reality, which is constitutionally protected in this country, by the way.